Excellent. Well, I'm up here with John Tures. He is our next presenter. He holds a doctorate in political science. This is illustrating how we are breaking out of just having a series of stuffy old historians up here. We're becoming multidisciplinary. And he's going to talk to us today about what it takes to win a battle in the War of 1812. And so without any further ado, John Tures.
Thank you very much. We don't have auditoriums. We tend to be in classrooms and smaller groups. I actually chaired a presentation down in Savannah, and there were two presenters and two people in the audience, and then there was myself. So that's sometimes what you normally get. And so this is a little different fare for me. Nor do I have spotlights, microphones, laser pointers, everything else, and a nice 15-foot screen where I can identify all the people who put in a lot of hard work. And I do want to mention all their names. That's Kyle Armstrong, Derek Duran, Austin Fryer, Kyle Gutowski, Katie Hearn, Marley Hurst, Anthony Jenkins, Alex Murfin, Adam Terranoni, David Teskey, Joe White, and Isaiah Whitfield. This is based on a research project from two different classes. At LaGrange College, we have a January term, which means 1 month, and a lot of times the professors teach on whatever it is that's in their specialty. Sometimes you have travel groups go to Costa Rica, they go to Europe, they go to the Philippines or Hawaii. You know, it's a 1 month class. So we go a little deeper into May. But it also gives a chance for people to teach on subjects like horror films, or whatever their hobby or specialty is in an academic setting. So one of the classes I like to teach is the War of 1812. And so this is research based on two different classes. One class worked on the data, the other worked on the literature review. So this is the combined effort of two different classes. Now several of them have graduated, going on to do a whole bunch of things. We have people up here who've won the Outstanding Student of the Year award. I know some of them have gone off and done business. They've gotten in academics, and one of them works for the Atlanta Braves now, just got hired to do that. And if you think about it, the reason I bring up Atlanta Braves is this is going to be a little bit like Moneyball. Anybody here an NFL football fan out in the audience? A couple of people, right? You'll probably know one of the more controversial things other than last night's game between Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and all the fights that broke out there and illegal hits, is that the Cleveland Browns, the new Cleveland Browns, who have struggled at just about everything they've done, I think they've made one playoff appearance, is that they hired someone from baseball who's a Moneyball guy. And people are saying, you can't do that for football. You know, football's a different sport. Well, if you'll indulge me a little bit, and I do appreciate the quote from Patton about wars being won by men. They may be fought with weapons, but they're won by men. This is going to be a bit like Moneyball, but Moneyball is, of course, for those of you who know, it's not the end-all, be-all of baseball. Billy Beane has not yet won a World Series ring, although one of his acolytes helped out the Red Sox, certainly. Nor is this guaranteed that it would work in football. For example, you might find that if you, on 4th and 1, you have a 2/3 chance of getting the first down if you run straight up the middle. But that's very different from the individual moment in the Super Bowl with the game on the line, you know, and with the tie score, do you kick the field goal, a long field goal, do you go for it? You know, it's the statistics will tell you on average what happens, but it will not tell you what happens in every single situation. Nor does it constitute scientific proof. So when you hear me throw numbers out there, I'm just showing you tendencies, what happens on average, overall in general. There are certainly some cases where the material doesn't work. What we're looking for are which correlations are more of the factors that we're looking at are more strongly associated with winning a war, or excuse me, winning a battle in a war. They won't always tell you that it always succeeds, right? Just like, you know, when you go for run straight up the middle on 4th and 1, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But, you know, the tendency, let's say, going up the middle is different than if you were to try and run around the end. Make sense? Okay, so those are the ground rules we're playing. This is a sort of political science talk. Now, most times you get political scientists, they'll just tell you which candidate to vote for. I'm not going to do that today. I am fascinated by American politics, as you can see all the buttons up there on my bag. You'll also notice there are some Democrats and Republicans. I tend to be fairly nonpartisan. I do that to show that all students of all stripes are welcome. We got liberals and conservatives on this group of researchers. So let me move on to the next. Perhaps you recognize the name Donald Hickey. War of 1812 historian, where he says that battles often take on sort of a mythology. they're almost like, war stories tend to become a lot like fishing stories, and they kind of take a life on their own, and myth becomes legend, and sometimes legend becomes fact. Isn't there a certain line about when the legend becomes fact, then print the legend? I think from a Western movie. We tend to see this a lot with War of 1812 movies, or excuse me, War of 1812 conflicts, and the occasional movie about them. I actually wrote a article for the War of 1812 magazine about War of 1812 movies, or had some connection to that. Anybody ever seen the one with Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston? The Buccaneer? Yeah, that could probably give you more than enough to work with there. As scholars, we kind of peel behind the myth, look behind the conflicts. There's not, even when people have done that, they tend to do it battle by battle. They become experts on battle. This is certainly a War of 1812 Battle of New Orleans specific group. I'm sure some of you will recognize others. If I'm showing something up here and there's like a good example of a War of 1812 battle where you're saying you should add that to your list, do not hesitate to do so in the question and answer. So what are we going to look at today for the factors? Well, there are several of them that we've seen. Myths about winning any battle. More soldiers. More artillery pieces. It's better to be on offense. Better to be on defense. Better to have the home field advantage. Better to set an ambush. Better to set up fortifications. So our goal is that we're going to look at all of these factors, both individually, how well they perform, and then in a multivariate model where we throw them all together to see when factors are taken together, what happens. And I'm glad I heard about James Wilkinson, because he'll come up perhaps in one of the examples. But that's the goal, what we're trying to do with this. Now, force ratio, certainly one, having more soldiers. It can work well for either the major military doctrines like the attrition strategy, where you have more than the other side, they're each blasting each other away, and eventually the latter's numbers wear down. Currently, I'm teaching a January term on the Civil War, and I think it was Ulysses S. Grant who realized, hey, we have more than Robert E. Lee. If we keep fighting them enough, we'll have 40,000 soldiers left, and Lee won't have any left, because the North's army was numerically superior. And Grant would even put himself in vulnerable positions, daring Lee to attack him, because he knew he could resupply his men, and he had more of them. And Lee, every soldier Lee lost, he couldn't replace. You can see this at Lundy's Lane. You can see this at the massacre at Fort Dearborn outside of Chicago. You can either overwhelm people or just wear down your opponent. In the maneuver strategy, of course, you can divide your forces, you can flank your enemy, move around them, as you see at the Battle of Mississinawa, or you can catch the enemy in a crossfire. You can lead the enemy on in, hit them from both sides in a big V formation, as we did in the Battle of Chippewa, just over Niagara Falls on the Canadian side. But of course, as you can understand, there are sometimes disadvantages too when you have more. Wilkinson's attack up the St. Lawrence River toward Montreal, it almost defies logic how many soldiers he had and how badly he was thrashed by a smaller force. Perhaps it's based on overconfidence, where you're just so sure that you're going to win that nothing else can happen. We'll see how Seattle does against Minnesota today, because everyone is picking them to win. Sometimes when the other side has so many forces, they can essentially bunch up, and therefore they make a bigger target. Could this have happened at New Orleans? Hopefully some people will comment on that. But if you're a bigger target to shoot at, the cannon shots, the musket shots, if you're bunched up, that can certainly whittle down your enemy's forces. Artillery ratio. I think it was Battlefield Detectives or one of the scholars whose quote on TV said, Napoleon just loved starting off the day with a good artillery barrage. I prefer scrambled eggs, but nevertheless, some people he just liked the artillery and working them in. Not just in a supporting role as other times, but that would be what you led with in your attack. You can also see this in contemporary conflicts of the War of 1812, at the Battle of Fort Stephenson. Horseshoe Bend has been mentioned by my predecessors up there. General Jackson attempting to penetrate the creek wall at Horseshoe Bend, but they put up a pretty impregnable defense. Jackson's 6 and 4 pounders were bouncing off the walls. They realized they would have to storm them and eventually flank them from the rear of Horseshoe Bend. You see this in sea power too, with American frigates, most times when they battle each other, as Teddy Roosevelt did before he was president, wrote a book about the War of 1812 and naval engagements. And what he found was, unlike other sources that tended to be biased, the British like the British, the American scholars like the American boats, he found that pretty much whichever ship was bigger tended to win. Or pretty simple, straightforward. And probably some of you had seen Thomas Pickles out there. He gave a quote from my students a few years ago. He said, it's not how many guns, but who is operating them. Sort of a very Patton-esque approach. When it comes to offense and defense position, there's two ways to look at it. Whether one state would be better off if they were attacking, which may not have anything to do with the offense and defense ratios. James Fearon is a political science professor who's pretty much making the argument that offensive advantage, well, it depends. Perhaps you come across examples of, let's say, Nazi Germany attacking, World War II, French trying to focus on defense. But then most of you are probably thinking, well, in World War I, it was a different story too, where it was best not to be attacking. It was more of a defensive strategies worked out well. You can see this up by our nation's capital in the battles of Bladensburg and Baltimore. Most people may not know that. I think Bladensburg, it was the American forces they were numerically superior and they were supposed to initiate the attack, but certainly did not go very well. It's not one that we like to brag. That's probably why Bladensburg doesn't make too many American movies. But Battle of New Orleans is in several. Fortifications are pretty popular. Enjoyed the rendition of the Star Spangled Banner as the singer here. Who's in the audience right now? Just wanted an extra thank you for doing that. I even whisper the play ball every time. But in fact, this is where I got interested in the War of 1812. I was a defense contractor up in the D.C. area, and one of my coworkers was a living history reenactor who played laundress for Fort McHenry, and her husband, scholar, very diminutive guy with mutton chop whiskers, was a drummer boy. And he's up there banging away the drums, and she's inside the fort, and she said, we'll get you inside the fort. And then they had a reenactment of what the artillery bombardment was like. And blank rounds, and it was a U.S. military group that was doing this. And they're firing away, and let me tell you, anybody been involved in one of these? Have you ever been the one up in Baltimore? When they say it'll take your breath away, I think they really mean it. I mean, the shock of the concussive blows, takes a toll on your chest and on the microphone. The shock and awe, you get to see where it was at. There's certainly a medieval analogy to these with the castles. And as I'm teaching my students Civil War forts, they're all the rage. After Fort McHenry, you see forts built all over the place, most often in the style. Aren't there some down here? St. Philip and Jackson, further to the south? Although I'm told that Fort St. Philip is manned actually by Cottonmouth instead of... My romantic notions of getting on a boat and going across and seeing Fort St. Philip have been dissuaded somewhat. I guess it is post-Katrina. That's a dangerous place to be. Certainly successes at Fort McHenry, the Indian Barrier at Horseshoe Bend and at Fort George. Perhaps holding the fortifications or something that maybe they are invalidated by the rifled cannon of the 1850s and 1860s, but decades earlier, this might be an important factor to have. It's better to be in a fort instead of out of it. Now, how far can we go in one of these without quoting Sun Tzu, The Art of War? He had ideas about, or stuff attributed to him has ideas about frontal methods of waging the enemy, but a lot of times it's better to engage in a surprise attack. Changing the circumstances, especially if you have fewer soldiers. Better to catch them off guard than just go wading into conflict. And most of you are probably thinking, well, of course, why wouldn't you do that? But keep in mind, we're talking about a different notion where even, let's say, I've just finished a book about the CSS Hunley, which I learned has origins in New Orleans. That's where the first boats were built, and they were tested at Lake Pontchartrain. Keep in mind, there were a lot of people who were saying, they called them infernal machines. They were seen as like against the notions of war. They were seen as illegal. The way we would evaluate terrorism today as being an illegal form of warfare. The same thing with ironclads, mines, and torpedoes. So ambush, we have, you think, well, of course that's practical. But keep in mind, back in those days, I mean, ambush is considered fighting dirty. You're supposed to be up front. You're supposed to meet on the field of battle. And sometimes you might arrange that time or, issue a challenge to the other. The sneaky attacks are considered very poor form. Colonel Stanbury pointing out how smaller forces able to overcome larger ones with the surprise, but also the confusion it would lead with the surprise attack. It may not be nice, but it's effective. Analogies come from the Battle of Beaver Dams. Excuse me. Anybody know who the character is in the middle? You got it, Laura Secord. You get one of the free books. No, I'm just kidding. If you can find that. Sort of the Canadian Paul Revere. As you can see in our project, we've also had women who will take Civil War classes and War of 1812 classes. And so they get to realize that while American soldiers were occupying her house, and she said, okay, just have fun. You can take over the house. She could sneak on out. She's sort of Canada's Paul Revere, and let the local garrison know that there were a lot of Americans there and they were caught off guard. Attacks during the Vietnam War certainly make the list as well. And then finally we move on to battle location. And my first picture, this is actually a picture of the Battle of, some people call it Plattsburgh, or the Battle of Lake Champlain, the location and knowledge of home terrain. The Americans knew this section of Lake Champlain better, and so what they did is they let the British come to them. They found a good spot to anchor. They knew the local areas, the defenses. They could have shore batteries. And this is how America took not just their first squadron. That was done at Lake Erie, but people said, well, those were just thrown together boats. That didn't really count. At Lake Champlain, they took out a superior force. And in most cases, the American ships are beating ships, let's say like the Saratoga is a corvette. It took a frigate, the HMS Confiance, one grade above, which is pretty impressive. We had converted schooners and gunboats taking out brigs. So it's a pretty impressive victory. And the knowledge of the home terrain is often cited as being with us. Need I say, the local knowledge of where to attack, where to set up the battle site could be instrumental in the Battle of New Orleans. We see these in other conflicts too, whether it be the contemporary Iraq conflict or the Nazi Germany running into generals winter and mud, being stuck in the winter, stuck in the summer. I bring this up because a lot of people say, well, why didn't the Germans just attack during the summer? Well, what do you think happens to all that snow in Russia? You could get bogged down in it just as easily in a Russian summer. Now what are we doing? This is, for the research design, this is sort of a reminder that what we're dealing with is a model. It's a representation of reality. Of course, it is not reality. We're not looking at every single factor. We're looking at several factors. We're looking for what the relationships are that we can see between these factors. We're testing a series of arguments about the nature of these relationships. So, anybody ever seen History Channel shows Battlefield Detectives? Okay. I think there's only one, technically, for War of 1812, and that's about the Shannon and the Chesapeake, the two ships. But we decided to look at primarily land battles and maybe threw in a few squadron conflicts, large fleets going after each other. We wound up with 77 battles. Now, in a few cases, like where we couldn't get data about how many artillery each side had, a few of them have missing cases, but for the most part, we tried to get as much as we could on these 77 major engagements. And so this is what the data looks like. Just for the purposes of numbers, when we went one, because we're in the United States, so it doesn't mean that Americans are better than the British. Do I have any British subjects out there? Okay. It doesn't mean that they're better. It's a delineation. 1, 0, -1. I might do the same for Democrats and Republicans. It doesn't mean that Democrats are better than Republicans or vice versa. It's just a way of identifying numbers differently. Almost like your computer is looking at a series of 1s and 0s. And what all these factors are over here this is the correlation that they have, each of these 6 factors, with the one at the top, outcome. As you can see, when we were looking at the Pearson correlation coefficient, you find those with asterisks are more likely to be statistically significantly associated at the correlation level with outcome. So in other words, the artillery ratio, believe it or not, the more artillery you had, the less likely you were to be successful. What that means is American advantage in artillery would lead to, therefore, British victory. Vice versa, British advantage in artillery, American victory. Perhaps some of those naval squadrons are responsible for that. The offense-defense, a positive correlation. If America's on offense, Britain's on defense, American victory. Conversely, when the British are on the offense, America's on the defense. Better chance of British victory. Not in every single case. Ambush appears to be the strongest associated with the outcome, and a little more about that. Okay, when we broke them down by a chi-square analysis, and what this is, I can show you a lot of numbers, and you'd say, okay, well, if I told you that in 24 cases, the Americans were on the offense, British were on the defense, and America prevailed in 24 of these cases out of 77, you'd be like, okay, well, that's like, what, 1 out of 3? Maybe a little less than that. I mean, it doesn't seem like, maybe a little less than, like, is that a lot? If, let's just say you were from another country and you didn't know much about baseball, and I said, wow, we got this one player who can, his batting average is .333, or 33 out of 100 times he gets a base hit, you would say, well, is that good? Right? I mean, it wouldn't mean much. It sounds like a low percentage. I mean, if you're shooting 33%, you probably can't even play for the New Orleans Pelicans. Am I correct? I mean, especially at free throw. Right? I mean, 33% is low in some cases. It would be high in others, depending on what you're trying to do. Correct? So what this model does is it looks at in a chi-square analysis, it looks at all cases of an American victory, all cases of American ambushes, regardless of the outcome. Right here, all American victories, regardless of whether they, were on offense or not. Here, this looks at all the cases where, America was on offense, Britain was on defense, regardless of outcome. And what it'll tell you is, in a null model, where there's, just based on the sheer number of cases where America went on the offense, the sheer number of American victories, you should have 17. And if you want, I can give you the formula. What it is we would multiply. You can do this. Anybody bring your calculator? Anybody bring a slide rule? Anybody bring your cell phone? Well, you can do this in your seats if you want, if you got a cell phone, because most of them have calculators. I do this with my students too. I'm like, oh, you bring my calculator. You got a cell phone? Oh, yeah? Okay, good. Then you can do this. You can look at the total number of cases where the U.S. had the advantage. That'd be 30 of them. Multiply it by the 44 victories the U.S. had. Divide it by 77, and you would get 17. Is that about right? Oh, 30 times 44 divided by 77, and you'd get about 17, right? Is that about right? Okay. So that tells you what you would expect. By the same token, to look up where do we get this number, 15.6, it's almost like when they say 2.3 kids. Where's my 0.3 kid? Where's my point? It's an average, of course. But you would look at all the cases where the British won, 30 of them, multiplied by, the number of times where the British were on offense, 40 times 30 divided by that, you would get 15.6. That makes sense. Does that give you a hint? It would give you a little idea. You could say, okay, look at these averages. This is what we would find. And for the chi-square analysis, this is one of the two factors where it was significant. So by itself, just offense-defense ratio related to outcome, when you look at these two factors together, they are significant. A Pearson correlation coefficient, like I said, it's just a correlation coefficient. This compares it to something. So it tells you the expected values. What you should get, 11.7, based on the sheer number of cases of American going on offense and British victories. Instead, you find 6, which is less than expected. Does that make sense? So that way you can get an idea. This gives you an idea, like you ever hear in baseball terms of Mendoza line? Right? You'd say, well, this guy was a really good fielder. He could field anything. He was like Ozzie Smith, but he couldn't hit his weight. And so people would say, well, you were well below expectations of what a shortstop can do. Based on the average of all shortstops, you should be at least hitting 250. and instead he would hit like 180 something. So despite being an excellent defender, he was often replaced, and that's where we get the phrase Mendoza line. Did y'all know that? Okay, if you're not a baseball fan. Wait, New Orleans doesn't have a baseball team, do they? I mean, Major League. They got like AAA, right? The Zephyrs? Okay. Are they still called the Zephyrs? Oh, okay, good. Although, you know, it's originally from Denver. Do they have Zephyrs out here? I mean, other than the baseball team. Oh, called the Zephyr. Okay, I got you. Well, we also tend to see this happening with ambush. Remember, that was the strongest factor in the correlation coefficient. Now, notice it doesn't mean that every ambush worked, right? I mean, sometimes you'd set a trap for the enemy and it would go bad. Anybody ever heard of the phrase, remember the river raisin? Yeah, the Americans tried to set a trap, and it didn't, well, it worked initially, and then the Americans kind of thought, oh, we can end the entire army, and the British sort of set, you know, a good counterattack, and it didn't go well for the Americans, and some of the prisoners were killed or mistreated, and so that's, before we had Remember the Alamo, and I'm a graduate of Trinity in San Antonio, they used to say, remember River Raisin. But it sounds kind of funny anyway, so I guess Alamo sounds better. It is funny to hear members of Congress go, well, what about America? Did we ever give up when we were at Alamo? And I have to tell people, that's not America yet. Not for another 9 years. Better use River Raisin. Although it doesn't have the same analogy. I think that it was an immigration debate. But you get to see, yeah, those Canadian immigrants. That's what it is. Native Americans, although that's a different immigration policy. But nevertheless, you get to see that when the Americans set an ambush, they tend to do better than expected. Now, it didn't work in every single case, but better than expectations, 14 compared to 18.6. When the British, Canadians, and their Indian allies, when they set up an ambush, tended to do better than expected. So you can see ambush is pretty strong compared to others. Don't worry, last bit of numbers up here for the day. That's the multivariate regression. This is where we put all the factors together in one big model. Kind of like when you're putting a salad together or a fondue pot and you're putting all the ingredients in at one to see what bubbles up. And this is what you get to see. Now remember down here, the ones with asterisks are the ones that are statistically significant. The constant is the intercept. Y'all remember this? It was like when you had to do slope coefficients when you were in high school or something. They were trying to figure out like how steep the slope was, dealt with how strong the relationship was. And you get to see, that I pushed the wrong button. You get to see that the constant was significant, but the one factor that really stood out when you combine all the factors together, force ratio, artillery, offense, defense, fortifications, ambush, and location, only ambush stands out, saying controlling for all other factors was a significant way to win a battle. Not a nice way to win a battle, remember? People were thinking it's better to get a white glove and slap somebody. But I think our first speaker today said, what was the Napoleon line again? Better to do something and then announce your intentions later. That sounds like a textbook for an ambush. And for the last dive, of course, we're not too far from Fort Mims. I pass it every time I go down here. I take my students to Fort Mims. When I first came there, by the way, has anybody here been to Fort Mims? Okay. If you haven't been in a while, by the way, they built it up. Every time we come down, there's like more built onto it. They actually have block houses, and they have an area where you can crawl up to a second floor. I mean, it's probably the biggest Fort Mims has been since Samuel Mims' house and fort were destroyed. When I first showed up, they had like one picket fence. And that was it. And it's nice to see every year they get a little bit. Certainly that was a classic ambush case where the Creek Indians, encouraged by the British, retaliation for the attack at Burnt Corn Creek, massacred a number of the, they were creeks that were friendly to the U.S., although they've become sort of westernized in subsequent paintings, of course. But most of them were considered white creeks, married into the family, but certainly bought into the U.S. government as an ally. And these ambushes were the factors that mattered in all cases. Initiating attack on its own tended to work out well, but not in conjunction with other factors. The significance of this factor is washed out by other things, such as your force ratio, your artillery ratio, other factors. And I hope this leaves me with a little bit of time for questions and also suggestions and comments if you think other factors would be good for my students to look at. I've already submitted this, but I'll be teaching this class a couple more times. I'd love to know which factors you suggest. If you are a fan of the War of 1812 and you think that a particular battle should be included among one of these factors, we'd love to work it on in. But thank you very much. Leadership. Leadership seems like a tough one to quantify. If you don't have the answer already about how to quantify it, do think about, like, and this is open for everybody else here. I agree with you. I think leadership is pretty important. And the next question would be, how do we get to leadership? How would we figure out to statistically analyze it? Or is it something we can analyze or not? Okay, years of experience might be a pretty good way to do it. I have not actually considered this, but in another study I had looked at experience of presidential candidates when they ran. Students and I looked at the relationship between experience and competence. By the way, in politics, there is no correlation between the two. I'm not saying this as a joke. That's actually what we found. You'd be amazed at, now, granted, we looked at political experience, like how many years you'd been in office, did you serve in a cabinet, how many years, were you a senator, a member of Congress, had you been a governor and stuff. We found it didn't matter near as much.
Got a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Right over here. Thanks. So what about home field advantage, which would seem to be, at least in a general way, something that would be important? And on ambushes, who did you find did the more? Can you explain a little more carefully what you said at the end? If it's a bivariate, there's a correlation, but if it's multivariate, it's not. Can you explain what you mean by that, please?
Bivariate being a pair of variables, so if we only looked at, only ran the numbers with just the one variable and the other variable being outcome, that's what our finding was. Multivariate was like looking at like all, 6 or 7 of them combined in the same model, looking at all the slopes at once. Right. It just shows that those with the ambush stand out more. What you tend to find is, that's why we run some of the multivariate models. Unless you have like thousands and thousands of cases, you won't find as many become significant when you run them for, let's say, a model of 7. I do have the numbers for you. Americans in our study ran, in 15 cases, they engaged in an ambush. In 13 cases, the British and their allies engaged in an ambush. The other 49, there was no ambush. It was like your classic Napoleonic style conflict. Good question. Oh, the home field advantage was not significant. And I'm thinking that's because what you often tended to see was, Americans would win some battles when they invaded Canada. But, like, for example, the Americans won decisively at Chippewa, but had to retreat after Lundy's Lane. So it tended to be a wash there. You saw big American victories, like, for example, the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh is killed and Proctor flees. But because of the weather, the Americans under William Henry Harrison, have to come back. The Americans blow a number of victories on their home base, too, Bladensburg being one of them. So in most of these cases, it'd be interesting if we could combine the leadership and the home field advantage in one. I like this idea of experience. I'm going to have to work that on in. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, you include deception with ambush? Because I think about the way Paul got embarrassed in Detroit.
Yeah, that's one of those cases where having a much larger forces. Certainly at Detroit, William Hull had larger numbers, but you're right, that sort of force amplification, which I'm teaching my Civil War students about. McClellan always felt like he was outnumbered 2-1, even though he had like a 4-1 advantage, because Prince John Magruder marches group back and forth. It reminds me, my wife is a big fan of Warner Brothers, and there's some episode of Sylvester and Tweety, and Tweety Bird has a Confederate cap. It was a different time. And Tweety is engaging in force amplification, making it look like there are many more soldiers than there really are to deter Sylvester the cat. I bet you didn't expect a political science professor to bring up Sylvester and Tweety either. Even with that, I still have a few students fall asleep in class. There was a question over here.
Yes, sir. Oh. Back here?
Oh, okay, sure, go ahead.
Can you see me?
I just now can. If you wave a white flag, I could probably see. No.
Okay. No, I was curious, on statistical, the selection of the pie, have you tried other models or other statistical items, or?
Oh, you mean like a hazard model?
A different model? I mean, I was just curious.
Oh, for different wars. You mean like for like apply this to the Civil War? Wow, that sounds like a great idea. I think I'm sure my students are cringing right now, but no, they're doing their individual research projects. But it might be interesting to try this on American Revolutionary War or Civil War. Is that what the question is? I think that's a great idea.
Statistical model versus the pie model you use. Is that what you use, statistical speaking? The mathematics of what you figured up. I mean.
Oh, sure. What would be a good one to have other than this?
I wouldn't know. I just thought you might know.
Oh, okay. I mean, you know, the first time we ran it, I ran a series of chi-square analyses. With the more recent class, I did the regression model or so. That's what I was wondering about, like hazard models. Unfortunately, we don't have enough cases for that. But, you know, we're looking at major battles, not the ones where there's like a small plaque somewhere saying, well, actually, there was a battle fought here, you know, a smaller group or so. Although I think Burnt Corn Creek make it in. Oh, wow.
They structured it somewhat like you did with 8 or 10 rules that they assessed in an artillery attack. And it predicted, you know, the success of it and all. When they applied it to the Gettysburg artillery barrage prior to the Confederate pickets charge on the third day, their artillery barrage was completely useless. And in factuality, that's what you found to be true.
Yeah, you know, students would even ask me about that. They're like, well, why didn't the Confederates just blow away the Yankee position and then send people through? And you're right. I mean, it was very difficult for them to reach from Seminary Ridge over. And not only that, they had to, after a while, they had to conserve their energy. Part of the problem was they started off with an artillery barrage to let people know where the attack was. And then when they halted, that let everyone know, okay, don't fire back any because soon a bunch of Confederates are going to move up the middle. Now, this is where deception sounds like it would come in, because that would be a great time to have your group like going through a flanking on Round Top, you know, where you engage in a cannon attack in the middle when your real idea is to take Culp Hill or something.
Wasn't the deception that the Union side pretended that they'd run out of ammunition with their artillery and preserved some of their artillery capacity?
How many of y'all seen Lonesome Dove? Remember that, the classic miniseries? I just got the soundtrack for it, and you know, my house was burned down years ago, and I finally found another copy of it. But I was remembering Gus McCall does something where he fires a shot or two deliberately short, and then the others come out to taunt him well within rifle range.
So here's another question is, so to what do you attribute the success of the Americans in the Battle of New Orleans after all this research? And more specifically, do you treat in your research the so-called night battle as an ambush, or were there ambushes in the Battle of New Orleans?
Ooh. I will have to look back at my Excel sheet to see if we have the December, I think it was 23rd attack. Yeah, okay. I love, by the way, the reenactment of that. That's always impressive. But you know, I think and I've had some conversation with people. Oh, you're going to New Orleans, and so I get a lot of people emailing me back and forth. But it strikes me that this is one where maybe artillery ratio didn't favor others in certain conflicts, or it may have been an insignificant factor in all conflicts, but much stronger in New Orleans. That's where I would see a huge advantage. And you know, it's amazing what Jackson's gunners were able to accomplish without rifled cannon as well, which is far deadlier much more accurate than the other. I recommend seeing the Civil War, was it Battle of Antietam Battlefield Detectives, where they take a modern rifled cannon and they're hitting the cannon, not just the target. So, a final question? Okay, go ahead. all numbered. Yeah, that's right. We did not look at it, but I'm glad you mentioned it, because one of my favorite quotes from the War of 1812 is, as the British march on Chippewa, and it looks like they're going to defeat the American militia, and the American soldiers did not get the correct uniform. They went with the cheapest that they had, which was gray, but they're all gray clad, and they are able to defeat Chippewa. And General Phineas Rawl, as he's leading his people in retreat, said, "Those aren't militia; those are regulars, by God." So, you're right. It does seem like that would be a good factor for us to look at as the type of fighter, and we did not make distinction. We just looked at raw numbers. Thank y'all very much.